The clicker is
Right
just
there.
a,
There's the one.
The German-free clicker, we'll have to know.
Yes.
Everyone sort of introduces who they are and
Yes.
everything like that. So very briefly, my background is I'm a former Russian studies person, who then became a lawyer, did Russian trade and investment work, have worked on transnational crime corruption issues, and sort of segue into cyber type things, but from a very sort of practical approach and not very technical approach, other than being a child of a psychotherapist. But I'm going to be dealing with that. You could just glance at it. I'm going to run through a bunch of slides fairly quickly. I'm one of these people that basically just talks to slides. I always like to say that, unlike everyone else who's presented, I don't have a bunch of buzzwords. I'll give you stuff that if you were actually taking very detailed notes, you would write it down. I plagiarize. Good thing about lawyers know you're allowed to plagiarize. It's footnoted. That's why you see all these things taken from judicial decisions and things like that. I don't pretend to write much more than things which sort of lead to what I plagiarized. What I'm not discussing, typically when people are talking about technology, insider threats, and this type of thing, they're dealing with operational type things. Decoys, honeypots, all this type of stuff. I'm not going to deal with that. Okay? I'm dealing with more the HR side of it and more the governance side of it from being internal, dealing with insider threats, not the operational side. Transparency, other things, it's insider threat is more of a sort of counterintelligence type thing, and also it relates to sort of deterrence failures. People who are inside are not deterred, the idea being that if they're caught, they're willing to run those risks for financial reasons, etc. It's sort of the roadmap in terms of what I'm hoping to cover, whether I indeed cover it as systematically as that would suggest remains to be seen. Polygraphs, which have ruined many people's lives in this city. Polygraphs, came into being in the 1930s with the FBI, and the people that were doing it wanted the public to believe that they were reliable. Then it went to a phase, more or less during the 60s and 70s, where they sort of it fell out of favor because it ruins lots of people's lives. There were a lot of lawsuits and things like that. 1983 came back into force under Reagan. The thing about polygraphs is that as part of a larger HR security and investigatory program, they have some value. But the thing is, if people are trained in terms of how to spoof a polygraph, or people are just sort of sociopaths, they could just get through this. And that's really interesting. For example, the major spy cases in the United States, involving CIA people and naval intelligence people, those people passed polygraph exams, given their nature. And the other thing about polygraphs is that if organizations believe that those individuals are so-called reliable, they'll be passed. Ames, who's like the CIA person, his father was CIA, and so people weren't really concerned about it. And anyway, that's important. Obama started looking again at trying to establish standards for the use of polygraphs, and that sort of brings us to the present in terms of things. One more thing to bring in. Snowden passed polygraph exams, but Snowden's father was a former NSA person, and Snowden, given the fact that he was relatively young, they just assumed that he wasn't going to be able to do anything wrong. He had nothing in his background that's problematic. Polygraphs are not predictive. When they do the polygraph tests, they first sort of start by doing an interview to create a baseline to see how anxious you are, trying to make you feel comfortable with the process. And typically, there are sort of two things that are done. The first thing is the comparison question test, which is like, did you kill John? This is like typically the way the police will do it, where they sort of know, in both cases they sort of think that they know the answer, and it's just more directed. And the other thing is kind of a silly thing, the guilty knowledge test, where they'll say that John was poisoned, and they want to see whether your body or your brain, as if it were separate from your body, shows some response. So anyway, those are the two types of things, and it's premised on the idea that either you will have deception that can be detected through technology, the brain waves or physiological type things, or it will change your behavior later on in the exam, or it will change your cognitive patterns in terms of the way you answer questions. Anyway, this just deals a little bit with the technology, none of which I'm terribly sophisticated about, but I've read about it, and you can read about it too.
It's interesting to tie this in with the work that Jim Giordano is doing.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the brain, right? You're talking about
Yeah.
different types of...
Yeah, when I heard that, I mean, my inclination is to be really skeptical. I don't know what the brain of a schizophrenic is like. I don't know what fantasy is like. I don't know, what dreams, how it gives. We do not understand a lot. And I always, when I go to these conferences and people say things, I'm skeptical is probably the best way to say it. Yeah.
I got to tell you, HRV though is an incredibly important measurement. It measures heart rate variability, not how quickly your heart rate goes from 60 to 65, but the discrepancy between the beats over time. And it is a direct, as close as you can get, is a direct measure of vagal stimulation. So I can tell very quickly how relaxed or fight or flight somebody is based upon that. And there's real world implications for that.
Okay, but let's give two situations. One, let's say a person is applying for a job and has already given notice of their other job, and they're concerned about paying their mortgage, and they're concerned about the future of their marriage.
Yeah.
Even with the baseline type stuff, they will act differently in the course of the interview. The relationship to the person who is questioning you will have a big role. And that's why they'll switch people giving the exams very often if it's being given over a 2-day period or morning and afternoon and things like that. I think I could talk about that for a much longer time if you want. You would ask me more about it. But anyway, this is some later discussions of the technology. I mentioned a couple of companies that are doing work in this area. You can go visit their websites. They're always selling. And private companies are buying, principally in the financial sector. And also companies which are involved with cybersecurity type things. One of the issues right now, which is a big stumbling block for U.S. Companies doing cybersecurity, is the shortage of people to do the work, and there's so many jobs which require security clearances. And so that you have a very big demand and a limited supply, and it creates a big bottleneck. The National Research Council, when they came out with their report, they thought they basically put polygraph examinations to rest. Because their accuracy and things like that. They thought that the theoretical rationale for using them was quite weak. It lulled organization into a false sense of security. It discriminated against minorities and people that had a sense of not really fitting in to society. And people who were from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, et cetera, can go on. There's a lot of research in this area in terms of the types of people that do badly. I mean, if you've grown up with the idea that the system, quotation marks, will not treat you fairly, you'll have a bad polygraph. and they'll have a hard time trying to find out the baseline. I mean, there are times when they'll substitute a member of a racial minority for the white person or the other type of person that they had questioning you. There's also a question if there's a political administration in power which is different than the one you would feel comfortable with being in power, but you have a civil service job, and they ask you questions which you think are implicating whether or not you would support the government policies. That's another issue.
It's really interesting, these technological fixes and the perception of the trust we have in tech to give us answers about anything.
Yeah, imagine right now if you are not a supporter of the Trump administration and you're trying to get a job at the FBI. With your comfort level as to whether you are going to be asked potentially to do things which is not consistent with your own political views. In the last issue of The Atlantic, there's an article that focuses by a guy named George Packer, and it focuses on an attorney whose last name is Newland, and she stayed on at the beginning of the Trump administration, and gradually there's more and more things being done at the FBI that she felt very uncomfortable with. And in that article, she's like discussing with George Packer, what would she have been like in Germany in the 1930s? At what point would she either resign, be afraid to resign, etc.? And that is what's going on right now in the U.S. government at places like the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of the Interior, Department of Justice. I mean, it's not by accident that more than like I guess it's 1,000 former DOJ employees are signing, petitions, criticizing Attorney General Barr. These people are from that organization. So imagine people who are still there. They're not all Trump supporters. These people are sort of the people that promote the use of polygraphs. Larry Farwell, I actually had this long conversation with, where I sort of challenged a lot of the things he said because I got to know someone who absolutely hated him. When you look at these guys' work, the number of the N on their experiments is frighteningly small.
Sorry, the
N.
N, yes.
It's sort of
Yes.
like an N of 20.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm sharing this with you in case you want to see it.
It's the same with telecommunications interception worldwide. You have this huge number of interceptions. How many are convicted?
Yeah.
A very, very small percentage.
Okay. There are many, many different definitions of who an insider is. I'm just throwing out one, which I think is okay, which sort of generally I use in my head. The most important thing is to differentiate between the cyber insiders who cause harm due to sloppiness versus the ones who are doing it out of malice.
It just seems like the biggest, like if I'm hacking, the biggest thing I want to do is use people who unintentionally help me, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm calling from IT, I need you to reboot your computer thing, and they're the insider, and I got them to do something.
Yeah, with the whole social engineering thing through a link. Yeah. Mind you, these are a whole bunch of people who are not falling within the category of insiders. I'll get back to the whole contractor thing, supplier thing in a while, because they're a sort of interesting story to tell. Perceptions of malicious insiders relating to cyber attacks. It's like between 25% and like 34%, or what the Verizon study and the IBM study is throwing out. The IBM data, by the way, is I think the best data, because what they're doing, Verizon does surveys, IBM is doing the data which they're collecting themselves, which they're following up. So of the cost of insider threat surveys done by IBM, which have been doing it for at least 5 years, I think, is the best thing out there when looking at this type of thing. But of course, in all these situations, you have overlapping definitions, and I'll just show that to you in a second. This is idea of the types of harm caused by insiders. Usually, it's the financial loss as opposed to loss of competitive advantage, which is sort of harder to quantify. Motivations. This is kind of interesting. It's just sort of showing you the difference between, or not, what it's showing what the qualities of a good spy are, which are very similar to what you would look for in terms of an insider that you would want to plant in an organization. The idea of an insider who is planted from the outside is very important. You think of, like, from an organized crime group, from a hostile country, etc., from a commercial competitor.
You had just put in there that the spy's goal is collecting information. If we go back to Giordano's definition of a weapon, the idea that we're influencing a decision or distracting a resource, not just passively collecting, but also manipulating and placing information. Is that in scope for what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, maybe it's mixing apples and oranges in the slides. When you think of spies, traditionally spies are collecting information. They're not like the special ops people. That's one of the funny things in the television series The Americans. I don't know if you ever watched that. The people who are collecting information are not the people who are being brought in from the outside to do special ops. They're very different type of people. The special ops people tend to be military people, and the other spies have personalities much more like journalists. The thing which is worth emphasizing, which is HR people are trying to bring people on board as fast as possible. And their interests are different from the overall organization's interests in terms of its long-term viability. It's sort of the front end versus the rear end in the operation. But they also have to be concerned about security risks and finding people who are qualified, etc. Oops. I'm just sharing this with you. I'm not going to cover all this stuff. Of all the things I've read in terms of deception detection from a behavioral standpoint, this woman I thought did the best sort of literature search. So I'm just going to share that with you. And why liars have problems. Because the idea being that the way, when liars are questioned, the way in which they respond is very different than people that are spontaneously interviewed in terms of their word choice, etc. There's a whole literature, and I'll share some of that with you later, just in terms of the names. The difference is that liars are noted for in responding to questions than, again, just people that are spontaneous. But at the same time, this is the same type of thing that you could be trained to do differently. And everything from facial cues to differences in groups, etc. This is also, Europol has a good study on psychological stuff.
Funny enough, we developed a cybersecurity management degree at UB that was, we use a lot of industry around here.
Yeah.
Guess what? We have a class from the psychology department. It's really multidisciplinary, right?
Yeah.
It's not about the technical side. We have a little bit on that, but it's for technical people. And actually, we we added a class on cyber, basically from the psychology department.
Meyer is also doing a lot of work in this area. This is one of my favorite quotes. I was sort of thrown into presentations, but these guys are getting a lot of DoD money for studies which I think have very little merit. I'm just throwing into that.
It looks sciencey.
Yeah, it looks sciencey. It's one of these situations that if you keep on putting in another variable, you get a smaller R squared. And you get And what's interesting, of course, is their technology that they're using is basically commercial technology that you can go to, a store and then fix things up. It's just not sensitive enough. But even if you look at the numbers that they generate, all these people, they're just not something that you could rely on independently. And what you end up coming away with is that the monitoring, combined with all these other tools is really what you have to come out with. You can't rely on all these other ways of addressing it. This guy, by the way, is Charles Morgan. He used to be at CIA. He does some of the best work in this area. He doesn't believe in any of that. He hates all the other people in the field who are pushing the technology, basically things that will con it, etc. And CIA would basically bring him to evaluate the equipment, and he would just basically shoot it down. And he's a nice person. Of course, I agree with most of what he writes about. These are some of the other studies trying to identify things that give away people who are being deceitful. Whenever the pupil size changes, their voices change, their lips change, changes in the facial cue, word choice, word number. These are some of the things that...
There's demonstrated technology out now that can do high fidelity diagnostics on emotional and medical state based upon voice and smell. It's crazy, the kind of metadata that can be derived from information that we're giving off all the time that most people aren't aware of.
Odovalence.
Yeah.
Jeremy Pitt wrote about odovalence recently.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Ethan?
This work is actually better. We see the number of cases that 253 is something you could have more confidence in. But even if you're collecting the data, applying the data is also, it's not perfect science in given situations. This type of data is always better used in connection with investigations, and also better when you have behavioral and monitoring stuff in place as opposed to predictive type things, obviously. The monitor team is very good. One of my favorite things is this, which always, do people know how this came about?
Give us the story.
Okay, the story behind this is very simple. The Israelis, the people who are doing airport security, are just like people who have just come out of high school, tend to be like smarter people than the people that we have at Dulles. And so that they just make up the questions. And so there was a guy who was asking a woman who had just come in from the UK. And so, he was going through, asking who she was going to see, what was she planning on doing, whatever. And then he just said, "Did you pack your own bag?" He wasn't ever told to do that. And then it turned out she had, and then he started asking, "Well, did someone give you something?" And she said yes, and this whole thing, and it turned out that there was a bomb. Actually, it was at the other end, I guess, because in the UK they do security there, just like LL does it there. But anyway, that's how the whole thing got started, just by happenstance, that someone asked these questions, and the fact that the questions varied with the answer. This is just a chance to look at different personality preference profiles and their interactions or their interfaces with other things.
Just to be clear, the dark triad is a good thing, right? I'm just thinking about myself on this slide.
I was thinking of uncertainty.
You can see the dark things.
I was thinking about bounded rationality.
Yeah, obviously,
Sorry,
obviously
I didn't do that one.
you can't see this, but you'll see how that research was done there.
I found these charts interesting.
Yeah, that was it.
I mean, this goes to Guy's stuff, right? I mean, just by knowing what somebody's searching for, or just by knowing the tone of voice, you can infer so much about that person. And then that your knowledge, your meta-knowledge about that person becomes an enrichment that you can sell. Because for ads on one side, or used for policy purposes on the other side.
By the way, for people that don't know, that CCDCOE is native. It's their center in Estonia. And they have a very good, like, cyber research, cyber thing.
We do a joint conference here in DC called Cycle.
Yeah.
Every year, once there.
Yeah, once there.
Estonia is a very interesting case, not only government, but also the geopolitical position for NATO.
Yeah, I
So
took their course on the international law and governance cyber operations. They have a bunch of good events. And this is just more of their profiling. And this is just things about monitoring and whether organizations in fact do it. And once again, you should be skeptical when you see these numbers in terms of whether everyone's being done properly. And I'll just go see.
So Jim spoke about those last things. Just a slide before. It was all on the cyber threat
Yeah.
stuff. Then at the end with this three circles diagram. So what's your underlying premise, Ethan, regarding the predictive side of any of this?
I think there's an element that you could use, but you have to monitor it. I always say that it used to be, when the Soviet Union existed, the United States, with their own people, thought beforehand through the polygraph and through the background investigations, they could be reasonably confident in the reliability of their own personnel. And then they would, I guess, every 3 to 4 years, do an update in terms of polygraph and just some background things in terms of financial things. And we really didn't have very many people monitoring employees. Whereas the Soviets would basically have one person in a monitoring role for every person with an operational role, with the expectation that everyone was turnable. And they simply did not trust people. I think they may have been to the extreme, but maybe not.
So what happens when we start scanning brains, for example, start getting every bit of data that we were talking about before, behavioral data, search data, data about your medical history, data. Doesn't the uncertainty rise? Isn't there an error rate that we face?
Well,
We increase errors?
I would almost think like what happens when that data, which is being collected for some good purposes, is then used by other actors, or it's misinterpreted, or that's it's the unintended consequences of not only what happens when they get more, but what are we not looking at? That's
But the key issue is basically an exercise of risk assessment to which the unintended consequences, we have limited ability to foresee the actual like the risk that is associated with that. So I like, for example, Andrew's framework for risk innovation. So it takes a risk perspective on the innovation process.
right.
And I think Andrew's work on that is really interesting, because when I look into the work, for example, that I do in value creation, and you combine that, you can actually understand, that you have company different drivers, but then you can actually blend it, that two perspectives of how we create value, at the same time understanding potential, unintended risks of that. So it's complex. I mean, and we need to acknowledge that, because a lot of the times the driver for innovation is actually performance gain. For example, if I develop, I'll talk this after a bit more about that, but they have the key driver is, the risks tend to be, I wouldn't say oversight, but tends to be, minimize the impact of them, because, the value proposition can be so juicy and you would do so much good, or improve the performance so much. So they have an issue of actual risk assessment.
I'm going to jump back very quickly to slide 15, because I want to tell you an anecdote. Because people remember anecdotes, and then we'll come back to this thing. But
If anything, we'll have to break to lunch, say 10 minutes.
sure,
Just-
I'll add 8 more slides, and you see how quickly I go through
No
it.
problem.
Okay, I went to a conference about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, where a senior VP of a major defense contractor in the United States that I wanted to give the company, because he sort of spoke off the record, and he was new in his job, and he was responsible for cybersecurity for his organization. So he had to monitor all of this.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. And he came out of DOD, though he had in between another commercial job. And I said, how in the world do you do this? Like, obviously you have a situation where you do a baseline, and then you have to do day-to-day and ongoing type things. So you have to do your own company. And then you have all this. Of course, I wasn't referring to this chart. And he said, well, we can't even do our own company. And I wish we could do that, but I have 5 people working for me, and we have facilities in probably 20 different locations in the United States where we actually make things. So that gives you sort of a sense of how overwhelming his position is. And if you think as an organization, someone like him is very likely to hire a company to do that type of work. But how reliable, how much could he rely on the reports that he gets when you have sort of an arm's length relationship? Because if you are like a Chicken Little over-reporting about bad things, there are going to be consequences. And the board of directors will be asking this guy about how security going, and if it makes it sound too terrible, his head may roll. So it's a very...
That's the wisdom of insecurity. If he's honest about it, he'll look bad. If he says it's good, it's secure, he doesn't have to like point out all the warts, then he'll keep his job and get a bonus.
Right, and boards of directors of companies don't want to know.
That's right.
Shareholders do not want to know. Companies do not report major cyber problems on their SEC forums. So that there's a desire basically to look the other way.
They're too busy. They can't be, you can't give them wisdom, it'll cause grief.
And so, I mean, the basic point is you always have to keep in mind the commercial and practical behavior that is driven by all these situations, so that when I see, quite frankly, the people who have faith in technology,
That do have faith in tech?
are pushing technology for various
Yeah.
purposes, I think of organizations I have worked for in the past, and how whatever is desired up above doesn't happen. And I can tell you lots of stories about that, but I won't bore you.
Over lunch.
Okay. With Ernst & Young does some good work in this area. Once again, this is their stuff. Everyone knows that sort of schematic in the center. This is the important thing always, which is continuous evaluation, constantly getting data on your personnel so you can monitor them, both online, and then the question is, what do you do about monitoring them not when they're online? I mean, how many people want to be sort of investigated, people checking up on you, your bank records, all this type of stuff? Even if they did, what's the likelihood that they would find stuff? I mean, there's not absolute transparency, and you don't want there to be transparency.
But that's what Jim was saying. You're not going to go and tell your enemy what you're doing,
Right.
But the thing to me is the new technologies that are allowing full transcriptions complete. Zoom is one of them, right? So how do I know the organizational Zoom I use hasn't been used to mine the data that is emanating from my mouth and those of whom I have discourse with, right? Of course it is. I have to assume any auditor, any good auditor, assumes that it is. If it's available, it will be, as auditors from Ernst & Young have told me.
Yeah.
So basically you go into an organization, they tell you pretty much you're guilty unless you prove yourself to be innocent. It's not the other way around. I walk into an organization, I expect there to be wrongdoing, right?
And the other thing, a place like McKinsey or Ernst & Young and all this, they're hired, hopefully, to give a clean bill of health to your organization. That's why you're hiring them. And so if they find a few major things, that's a victory. Anyway, there's some other little buzz paragraphs. This is important, the idea that the technology, even though everyone is in agreement of its limitations, is still used all the time, and there's no way of getting around it. And actors, be it hostile foreign governments, criminal organizations, simply individual criminals, are studying how to get around it. It's a profitable thing. And
Thank you so much, Ethan. Thank you, as always. Well, that wraps up